Now, front page of this week's Farmers Weekly is some new research to get excited about. This is proving that there's a strong case for sheep and beef farmers to credit the sequestration happening on their farms. I know that sheep and beef farmers have certainly been on this bandwagon for quite some time, and all it needs sometimes is a stamp of approval from an academic, and this independent research was commissioned by Beef and Lamb New Zealand with Auckland University of Technology's Ecological Department, and it's found that New Zealand sheep and beef farmers are close to being carbon neutral. Dr. Bradley Case joins us now. Bradley, you've got an entire country of sheep and beef farmers that want to shake your hand.
Yes, that could be, yeah.
Now, what was your background going into the research around this formal recognition of on-farm sequestration of carbon?
Well, I guess myself and some other colleagues, we have been working on some research looking at biodiversity on sheep and beef farms as a part of the National Science Challenges. That research finished a year or so ago, but that really got us, I guess, looking into the vegetation that's out there on farms, on sheep and beef farms in particular. And some work that came out of that showed that, in fact, there's a lot of vegetation on sheep and beef farms, as most sheep and beef farmers obviously can tell you. They're quite extensive. And there's a lot of patches of native bush, and there's some plantations and other small bits and pieces of vegetation. And so making up 40% of the country, they actually also account for about 17% of our remaining native biodiversity in terms of woody vegetation. So that's quite a contribution, and that's how really I got started on this.
And I feel like I've heard every argument under the sun in the last 3 years, in particular around this. And every sheep and beef farmer says to me, this is madness, Sarah, because pine trees are not the only thing that sequester carbon. Living things need it to grow, yet the politician's argument is it's not fast enough.
Yeah, well, it depends on the time frame you use, I guess. So it's true that exotic plantations sequester carbon quite quickly. There's no doubt about that. But we have to be mindful that there's consequences that occur not too far down the road when you harvest pine plantations, and you lose that carbon basically 15 or 20 years later when you harvest them. And there's also losses from soil and things like that. So the way we advocate is for native vegetation mainly, just because, first of all, early successional or young pioneering native vegetation that comes into areas on farms, they sequester quite a lot of carbon. And then if you can get some of these tall native forests establishing on your farms, or you can manage them so that they, to encourage the growth of those aspects of our native vegetation, then you get actually quite a lot of sequestration over the long term. And in addition to that, you get the benefits that come along with the native vegetation. So you get biodiversity and water quality management and habitat for our native organisms. So, so while it may be slow in some ways, you get all of these multifunctional benefits at the same time.
So in terms of wrapping around formal recognition of this, and I've followed with great interest the work that Tutoi are doing with a carbon calculator. Have we got science feeding into the ultimate calculator for the dream accreditation that marketers want?
I think from my understanding, we're still a little ways away from actually being able to do that. This study that we did was really a broad scale study across New Zealand, and it was using figures for emissions across the sector and figures as best we could for sequestration across the whole sector. But at the farm scale, you're looking at more detailed information that's required to get at those calculations. So I know there are a lot of groups working on that. and a lot of interest in that, obviously, in terms of getting credit for it. So I think you watch this space, and we'll see more and more of this coming out over the next few years. Yep.
Yeah, certainly. In terms of being able to set a target of sheep and beef farmers being carbon neutral by 2050, this was an industry target, not a government target. But you're saying that we could effectively have that stamped far sooner than 2050 with the science that we have got in research going on?
Yeah, I mean, I have to just put the caveat around what we did in that there is quite a range, and you might have seen that, it ranged from, say, 63% of emissions to over, actually accounting for all emissions on the other end of the scale. And that's because a lot of the data we have on sequestration is quite, it's quite data poor, to be honest. And so we're relying on figures that we can get from the literature and stuff around that. So I think that we just have to keep moving forward, basically, using this as a baseline of evidence, I guess. And so I'd rather not put are we going to be carbon neutral or not around it? And I'd rather instead say, well, this is a good result. I think we can be proud of that, and I think we can now use that as a basis for talking about how we can actually improve on that, and that's both in terms of emissions and in terms of managing our vegetation for sequestration.
And in the work that you do in the ecology department at Auckland University of Technology, there's so many moving parts for our farmers to get their head around, yet they are the ones that can see and work with nature every day, yet being told so many different things that they shouldn't, couldn't, shouldn't be doing. But biodiversity is so interlinked with freshwater quality, carbon sequestration, the whole lot. Do you think that we're finally getting to a point that this is a holistic approach, and that farmers actually do understand their own environment, and that we can actually wrap those decision making back round the person that understands it very deeply?
Well, I think that there's a lot to be said about what you just said, actually. And, we did a survey of 500 farmers recently that was just published and came out in the media quite recently. And that was about biodiversity and farmers' understanding of biodiversity on their farms. And it was quite clear from that farmers understood what biodiversity was, they valued it. And what was also clear on the other side of it, of course, was that there were barriers to them being able to actually manage for it, most of it around cost and understanding of what to do. And so I think all of this work builds towards our understanding of that. And I think that there is a critical motivation now, particularly through initiatives via the government like Hiwaka Ekanoa and things like that, to really work with farmers in a real legitimate sense through farm plans and things like that to actually, work in co-design, I suppose, to figure out what the way forward is for this in a practical way, as opposed to like more in an academic way.
That's absolutely one of the most practical things I've heard on the show. Well, thank you so much, Bradley Case there, joining us from the Department of Ecology at Auckland University for Technology, AUT, following the report on the front page of Farmers Weekly this week that shows that sheep and beef farmers are actually that close that should get credit for sequestration already happening on their farms and could already be carbon neutral. This is Sarah's Country.